bees moved among the blossoms, their wings humming like threads of silk in the air, carrying dust of gold from flower to flower. Through summer's warmth and meadow's stillness they worked, drawing sweetness into hives built of patient order. Within the combs, the wax thickened, pale and fragrant, laid down layer by layer as days lengthened, and the sun wheeled slowly across the sky. Men came with smoke in their hands, cloaked in rough wool, their faces hidden beneath hoods. The bees retreated before the haze, their music fading as the combs were cut and lowered into baskets of wicker. The air filled with sweetness and the faint perfume of wax, a scent that clung to the hands of those who gathered it. They walked the long paths back to their village, the combs wrapped in linen, guarded as though treasure. In small stone houses, the wax was melted. Iron pots hung above flames, the combs pressed until honey ran into bowls. Thick and golden, while the wax rose upon the surface like pale skin, it was skimmed, poured into molds, left to harden. The molds were simple, at first wooden, carved by calloused hands. Later, copper forms gleamed by the hearth, their shapes narrow and tall. The wax cooled, taking form in silence. Smooth and pale, it lay like frozen sunlight, waiting. Wicks of twisted flax were cut, dipped into the melted wax again and again, each layer thickening as the air cooled it. Hands repeated the motion without haste, without change, until the candles hung in rows. Stiff and patient, their scent, faint but steady. Some would burn in chapels where monks prayed through endless nights, their flames swaying above pages of scripture. Some would flicker in great halls, their light gleaming on goblets and armor. Some would rest in humble cottages, their glow small, but enough to keep darkness at bay. Each candle was a life waiting to be lived, a span of hours measured not by words nor by bells, but by the slow rising of melted wax upon its sides. And so they were gathered in baskets, wrapped in cloth, carried to market where traders cried their wares beneath timbered roofs. Candles beside salt, candles beside bread, candles among bolts of cloth. Buyers came with coins or with eggs, with flour, with promises. The candles passed from hand to hand, from village to town, from merchant to priest. One candle, pale and slender, found its way to a monastery beyond the fields. There it was set upon a shelf among dozens more, its body straight, its wick unburned, waiting for the moment when flame would give it purpose. The days passed, the air of the monastery, filled with the sound of bells and chanting. The candle waited still. Dust settled softly upon its surface, disturbed only by the footsteps of monks and the stirring of cloaks in the long stone halls. And one evening, the sun sank and the shadows deepened. A hand reached for it. The candle was placed upon the altar, and the flame was given. The wick caught the spark, and at once a small, trembling glow rose into the silence. The monks' chanting did not break, but the shadows shifted, bending away from the new light. The flame danced, thin as a reed at first, then steadied, its heart blue, its crown golden. The candle breathed, and the long hall of stone seemed less cold. The wax softened near the wick, forming a tiny pool, clear as glass. From its edges, drops began to fall, slow and careful, sliding down the candle's side until they hardened in rippling patterns. Each drop was a mark of time, silent and irrevocable, recording the life of the candle with shapes like frozen tears. Around it, the monastery held its stillness. Stone arches curved high above, their weight pressing down in silence broken only by chant and the faint crackle of flame. Monks in dark habits bent over their psalters, their lips moving in rhythm with the bells that tolled outside. Some fingers traced letters on parchment, others clutched wooden rosaries. All were wrapped in the candle's glow, their faces pale, their eyes half-shadowed, their breath rising like faint smoke into the air. The night deepened. More candles were lit, their flames joining in chorus, casting a honey-colored glow upon the walls. Yet each was solitary, each flame bending in its own rhythm, each life measured in its own melting. The candle upon the altar burned the brightest, for it stood at the heart of prayer. Nearest to the chalice, nearest to the book, where words of centuries lay inked in black and red. Time thickened. The chants ended, the monks dispersed into cloisters, their footsteps echoing on stone. But the candle remained, holding its vigil. Shadows stretched across the nave, tall and thin, bending like silent figures between pillars. The flame flickered, and for a moment the shadows seemed to bow. The wax pool deepened, its rim trembling as if with breath. A drop overflowed, sliding slowly down, leaving a bright trail that cooled into ivory. Layer upon layer, the candle's body reshaped itself, smooth at birth, now sculpted by the passing of hours. It was a slow artistry, unseen by those who prayed, yet perfect in its patience. Beyond the thick wooden doors, the world lay dark. Wind pressed against shutters, carrying the cry of night birds and the rustle of leaves. But within the candle, guarded its circle of light. Books lay open in its glow, the letters sharp against the parchment, the ink glimmering faintly. The scribe bent low, his hands steady, though his eyes grew weary. The candle's light did not falter. Minutes slid into hours. The wax shortened, the flame bent lower, the shadows grew taller. The air grew thick with the mingling of wax and incense, a perfume of devotion. The monks slept in their cells, their dreams touched by the glow that flickered through cracks and wooden doors. The candle did not sleep. It had no voice, yet it spoke in its burning. Each flicker was a syllable, each drop of wax a word, each shift of shadow a phrase in the long hymn of night. And when the bell tolled again before dawn, the candle was shorter, yet its flame still held. Pale light seeped through high windows, gray and cold, meeting the gold of the flame. For a moment, they mingled, day and night, clasping hands in silence. Then the monks returned, their sandals whispering on the stones. They found the candle bent but unyielding, its wax heavy with the mark of ours. One reached forward, cupped his hand, and with a breath the flame was gone. The smoke curled upward in a single line, thin and straight, rising into the high arches before fading. The candle rested, its body marked by its first vigil. Its wick blackened at the tip. It had lived a night, and in its silence it waited for the next. The morning bells rang louder than usual, their iron voices rolling across the valley and echoing against the hills. From villages scattered among the fields, men and women walked the winding road toward the monastery, their steps slow, their garments plain, yet their hearts stirred by the promise of a holy day. Children clung to their mothers' skirts old. Men leaned upon staffs, and the air was filled with the sound of sandals against stone. Within the great church the monks had made ready. The floors were swept, the tapestries straightened, the silver polished until it shone in the dim light. Choir stalls were lined with psalters, the lectern stood high with its gilded book, the altar gleamed beneath a cloth of embroidered linen. Along the nave, tall stands were set, each bearing a candle slender and pale. Waiting in silence. From the shelves in the sacristy, hands reached for the candles. One by one, they were carried into the church, placed in their holders, set in rows along the choir. Upon the steps, before the statues of saints, the candle that had kept vigil through the long night was lifted from the altar, trimmed, and set once more in its place of honor. Its wick was blackened but ready, its sides streaked with ivory trails, its body shortened yet strong. The doors opened wide, and the people entered. The sound of sandals upon stone mingled with the low murmur of voices and the faint rustle of woolen cloaks. The monks filed in from the cloisters, their voices already rising in chant, deep and steady, echoing from the arches above, and then the candles were lit. Flame leaped from wick to wick, slow spreading of light that pushed shadows. Back into corners, golden pools of brightness formed upon the stone, upon the carved wood, upon the painted faces of saints in glass. The choir filled with warmth, the statues seemed to breathe, the walls glowed as though alive. The candle upon the altar caught fire once more, its flame steady, brighter now for the company of so many others. Around it, the choir sang, their voices weaving with the flicker of light. The two inseparable, song and flame, prayer and wax. The mass began. The priests moved in solemn rhythm, their vestments heavy with gold thread, their hands lifting the chalice, their voices low and resonant. The people knelt, their heads bowed, their lips whispering prayers. Children gazed upward, their eyes wide at the blaze of candles, at the colors in the glass that shifted with the light, at the solemn faces of monks whose voices filled the air like waves. The candle burned, and its wax softened. Drops ran down, hardened into ridges that caught the light and gleamed like ivory carvings. The flame bent in the draft of moving robes, wavered as incense smoke coiled upward, but did not falter. The choir swelled. The sound rose into the arches, filling the high vaults until even the stones seemed to vibrate. Trumpets joined, then drums, and the air shook with sound as mighty as thunder. In the glow of 100 flames, the church was no longer stone and timber, but a hall of light, a world apart, a vision of heaven. The candle's flame trembled, yet in its small circle of light it was part of that vision. Its glow touched the golden chalice, the silver cross, the pages of the great book. It mingled with the sunlight that fell through stained glass, reds and blues and greens shimmering together in a dance that moved across the walls. Hours passed, but the light did not fade. The feast day stretched long, filled with prayer, with song, with silence between. When at last the bells rang once more and the people began to leave, the candles burned still, shorter, thinner, their sides heavy with wax that had flowed like rivers in slow motion. One by one, they were extinguished. Smoke rose in thin gray threads, curling into the air, carrying with it the faint perfume of wax and wick. Shadows returned to the corners, the colors in glass dimmed. The statues fell silent once more. The candle upon the altar was the last. Its flame bent low, its wick curled, its wax hollowed. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and in an instant the light was gone. The smoke lingered, rising like a prayer unfinished. The nights grew longer. Frost traced the windows of the monastery, white feathers of ice spreading over the leaded glass until even the stars were hidden. The wind pressed against the shutters with a low moan, carrying the breath of snow from the hills. Within the stone walls, the air was sharp. Each breath, a cloud in the dimness. From the shelves, the candles were taken once more. Their pale bodies cold and rigid, their wicks trimmed. They were set in iron holders along the choir, on wooden desks in the scriptorium, before the images of saints that stood in niches of stone. When the last bell of the evening tolled, a spark touched wick and flame returned. The candle on the altar woke again, its light bending against the draft of the winter wind. Its glow was small, but in the vast hall it cast warmth that the cold could not reach. Shadows leapt upon the pillars, long and wavering, stretching upward into the vaults where the darkness lingered. The monks came with their hoods drawn low, their breath rising in pale wisps. They knelt on the stone floor, their hands folded, their voices murmuring the night office. The chant was soft, broken by coughs, heavy with weariness. The candle burned steadily, its flame leaning toward them, gilding their faces. Touching their lips as they shaped each syllable, the wax thickened at its base, flowing like slow rivers that hardened in rippling forms. Each drop froze into pale ridges, like frozen water against a mountainside. The body of the candle was smaller now, yet its flame still stood upright. A single golden tongue in the sea of shadow. Outside, the snow fell. It lay upon the cloisters, upon the gardens long barren, upon the roofs of the village where only thin smoke rose from a few chimneys. The world was buried in white silence, but the monastery still glowed with points of fire. Each window faintly golden against the night. The scribe bent over his parchment in the scriptorium, the candle at his side, throwing its glow across the page. His quill scratched in slow rhythm, the ink pooling in black strokes. The letters curled and stretched, perfect and patient, each guided by the steady light. His eyes watered, his fingers stiffened, but the candle did not falter. The hours passed. The monks withdrew to their cells, leaving the great hall empty, the flame alone with its shadows. The wind rattled at the doors, snow hissed against the shutters, yet the circle of light held. Dust drifted through the air, catching in the glow, tiny sparks of gold in the darkness, and in the silence, the candle seemed to breathe, its flame. Bent low, then lifted, flickered, then steadied, as though listening to the night. The wax curled at its edges, the wick leaned, but still it burned. When dawn came at last, pale and cold, the candle was shorter still. Its body hollowed, its sides layered with the record of its hours. The monks returned, their sandals whispering against the frost on the stones. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and the flame was gone. The bells called not for feast, nor for vigil, but for penance. Their sound was lower, slower, each stroke, echoing with gravity that carried across the valley. From the village the people came in with cloaks drawn tight. Women with shawls pulled low, children clutching their mothers' hands. Their footsteps crunched upon the frosted earth, and their voices were hushed, as though the air itself commanded silence. Within the monastery, the church had been prepared. Candles lined the walls, their bodies tall and pale, each one waiting. The altar cloth was plain, the chalice unadorned, the stone floor bare. The monks stood in their stalls, hoods shadowing their faces, their hands folded within their sleeves. A spark touched wick, and the light spread. One by one, the candles awakened, their flames trembling at first, then steady, until the whole nave was filled with golden glow. Shadows bent across the pillars, moving with the breath of the flames, wrapping the arches in silent waves. The candle upon the altar burned again, its wax scarred by many nights, its wick blackened, its flame clear. It cast its circle of light over the book of Psalms, over the chalice, for the priest who now raised his voice in solemn chant. The people knelt upon the cold stones, heads bowed, hands clasped, eyes lowered. They murmured their confessions. Some wept, their shoulders shaking, their tears catching the glow of the flames. Others stared at the floor, lips pressed tight, silence heavy upon them. Monks intoned their prayers, voices deep and slow, weaving with the flicker of fire. The candle burned steadily. Its wax softened, flowing down in slow rivulets that hardened upon its sides. Each drop seemed to mark a sin, whispered. Each flicker seemed to echo a prayer uttered. The flame bent low, then lifted as though listening, as though bearing witness. The chants grew louder. The priest's voice rang against the arches, his words calling for mercy, for forgiveness, for the lifting of burdens heavy upon all. The people struck their breasts, the sound dull and hollow in the vast hall. The children hid their faces, clinging to their mothers, their eyes wide at the solemnity. The candle's glow mingled with incense rising in coils, filling the air with perfume bitter and sweet. The smoke curled around the flame, wreathing it, yet the light pierced through, steady and unwavering. Hours passed in prayer and silence. The people rose, their faces pale, their eyes wet, their voices hushed. They crossed themselves, turned, and walked slowly back into the night. Their footsteps faded, their cloaks vanished into the dark. The monastery was left with its monks alone. The bells tolled once more, their voices heavy with finality. One by one the candles were extinguished, their smoke rising like thin fingers toward the vaults. The altar candle burned last, its flame bending, its wick curling, its wax hollowed by the night. The stone corridors were dark after Compline. Only the faintest glow lingered along the cloisters where the day's last prayers had been whispered, and the air was heavy with the fading echo of chant. The monks moved in silence, their sandals brushing the cold floor, each carrying the weight of solitude upon his shoulders. Doors closed one by one, their wooden frames creaking, and soon the monastery sank into stillness, as though the very walls had gone to sleep. From the sacristy, a candle was taken shorter now, scarred with the marks of previous vigils, its sides hardened in ivory folds. It was carried carefully, cradled as one might bear a fragile relic, and placed within a small iron holder. The monk who bore it walked the narrow stair, his hand steady, despite the draught that wound through the stone. The flame trembled, but it did not die. The cell was small, a chamber of stone no larger than a shepherd's hut. Its walls were bare save for a cross of wood, rough-hewn, fixed above the low bed. A desk stood by the wall, its surface worn smooth. By years of use, upon it lay a book bound in leather, its clasps tarnished, its pages thick with the scent of ink and time. A stool stood nearby, plain and sturdy. In one corner, a clay jug rested upon the floor beside a wooden bowl. The monk entered, bowed his head toward the cross, and set the candle upon the desk. The flame spread its glow outward, pushing shadows back into corners. It revealed the grain of the wood, the lines upon the stone, the threads of the course. Blanket upon the bed, touched the edges of the book, glimmering faintly upon the clasps. As though awakening the words hidden within, the monk sat. His cowl hung low, his hands folded upon the desk. For a long time he did not open the book, but simply watched the flame. It bent and lifted, its rhythm slow and patient, like breathing. The wax softened at its crown, a pool, forming that reflected the tiny light as though it were a second flame. The monk's face, worn with years and silence, glowed in that reflection. His eyes were tired, yet they did not close. At last he opened the book. The parchment sighed as it turned, the ink shining faintly in the glow. His finger traced the words, line by line, as his lips moved in silence. Sometimes his brow furrowed. Sometimes he closed his eyes, letting the words sink deeper. The candle burned, its flame steady, its light turning black letters into living thought. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, rattling them faintly. The night was restless, carrying with it the murmur of branches and the distant call of an owl. The monk heard, but did not look away. The candle's flame was enough. Hours passed. The wax flowed in slow rivulets, hardening in folds that glistened as they caught the light. Drops gathered at the rim, then fell, cooling into pale beads upon the desk. The wick leaned, its tip glowing red, its smoke faint. The flame bent low in the draught, then rose again, refusing to falter. The monk's hand grew still, his eyes closed. His head bowed, and for a time he seemed to sleep, though his lips continued to move faintly in prayer. The candle stood watch. Its light did not waver, but spread softly across his face, gilding his cheek, tracing the hollow lines of his years. In the stillness, the cell seemed less of stone and more of silence made visible. When the monk stirred again, turned another page. His hand trembled. His breath was slow, but his eyes remained fixed. He read not to know, but to remain awake, to keep vigil while the world outside lay hidden in darkness. The candle's flame bent toward him, as though listening. The night deepened. The wind grew colder, the shutters shook harder, but within the cell, light remained. Wax gathered at the base of the candle, a small hill of pale ridges. The body was shorter now, its life measured in hours, given freely to silence. At last the monk closed the book. He traced the cross upon its cover, folded his hands, and whispered a prayer. His voice was barely a breath, yet it filled the small chamber. Then he rose, laid himself upon the narrow bed, and pulled the blanket to his chest. The candle burned on, the only witness to his rest. It cast its glow across the wooden cross, across the still figure upon the bed, across the book that lay closed but not silent. It burned until the first pale line of dawn crept through the crack in the shutter. Its flame bent low, its wick curled, and with a faint sigh of smoke, it gave back the last of its light. The bell tower spoke before dawn. Its voice rolled across the valley, deep and unhurried, shaking the frost from the trees and stirring the village from its sleep. It was not the toll of mourning, nor the low note of penance, but something brighter, measured, solemn, yet lifted as though to call the world awake. Today was a feast, one of the holy days that broke the long rhythm of work and silence. The villagers made ready, mothers wrapped children in woolen cloaks, fathers shouldered staffs, old men leaned upon their sons for strength. They walked the winding road toward the monastery, their breaths rising in clouds. From far away, they could already see the glow upon the hill, faint at first, like a single star fallen to earth, then growing brighter as they drew nearer. Within the church, Preparations had begun long before the bells. The monks moved silently, their dark habits whispering against the stones. They set candles into iron holders along the choir, into tall brass stands that gleamed faintly even in the dimness, into rows upon the altar steps, before the statues of saints, upon the windowsills beneath the high stained glass. Boxes had been emptied, shelves stripped bare today. Every flame would be called to life. The candle, scarred by nights of vigil, was placed once more upon the altar. Its sides were marked with frozen streams of wax, its wick trimmed and blackened, its body shorter than before, yet still it stood straight, awaiting the spark. Around it stood dozens, then hundreds, pale and silent, as though an army of slender sentinels had gathered. The doors opened. The people entered, their sandals brushing the floor, their eyes lifting to the vaults that soared above. The church was dim, filled with the smell of cold stone and old incense, but all eyes turned toward the rows of unlit candles, waiting. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then flame was given. It began at the altar, where one wick touched another, and the light spread outward in slow ripples. Each candle received its spark and passed it to the next, until the dark corners retreated and the nave glowed with warmth. Faces were gilded, arches painted in honey, the carved saints alive with a trembling radiance. Caught the light, their colors deepening, their figures of angels and martyrs shimmering as though they moved. The people gasped softly, for the transformation was sudden and complete. What had been stone became gold. What had been shadow became song. For the choir began at that moment, their voices rising with the flames. Deep voices of monks, high voices of boys, weaving into one another until the air quivered with harmony. The candles bent in the draught of their breath, but they did not falter. The candle upon the altar burned with them, its flame steady, its wax melting in slow streams that caught the light of its brothers. Together they filled the church with a brilliance greater than day, a light not of the sun, but of devotion. It shone upon chalices lifted high, upon vestments heavy with embroidery, upon the open book whose letters gleamed in the glow. Incense was lit. The smoke curled upward, wreathing the flames in silver. The scent was sweet, sharp, and heavy, mingling with the perfume of wax. Columns of smoke rose like trees in a golden forest, and the light pierced through them, scattering into shafts that fell across the congregation. Children watched wide-eyed, their faces half hidden in their mothers' shawls. Old men leaned upon staffs, tears glimmering in their eyes. The chants swelled, trumpets joined, their notes bright as fire, and the drums rolled like thunder. People knelt, and their prayers rose with the smoke, their voices weaving with the music, until stone itself seemed to tremble. Candles flickered, bent, swayed, but none went out. Their glow mingled with the sound until light and song were one. Time drifted like wax. The candles shortened, their bodies scarred, their sides heavy with hardened rivers. Yet still they burned, their flames never weary, their silence unbroken. Hours passed as if in a dream, the people lost in the glow, their eyes lifted, their souls carried on the wings of light. When at last the final prayer was spoken, the bells rang again, bright and triumphant. The congregation rose, their steps slow, their voices hushed. They filed out into the daylight, carrying with them the warmth of the flames. Within, the candles still burned. Their light was softer now, lower, their bodies diminished, but the glow lingered, filling every corner with memory. One by one, hands reached, snuffers fell, and smoke rose in thin gray spirals. The brightness faded, shadows crept back, colors dimmed. The altar candle burned last. Its flame bent low, its wick curled, its wax hollowed. For a moment it shone alone, proud and steady amid the darkness. Then fingers touched, and with a whisper it was gone. The smoke lingered, curling upward into the high vaults, carrying with it the memory of the day's light. The fields lay heavy with the breath of summer. Beyond the monastery walls the wheat had grown tall, bending beneath its own weight, swaying in slow rhythm with the evening breeze. Crickets sang their tireless song in the grass, and the air smelled of earth and ripening fruit. The sun had gone down in a blaze of gold, and now the sky deepened, shading from violet to black, with the first stars shimmering like distant fires. Within the scriptorium, the air was warm and still. Tall, narrow windows stood open to the night, their shutters pushed wide to let in the scent of fields and the hum of unseen wings. But the desks remained shadowed until the first candles were touched with flame. Slowly, the long chamber came alive, here a point of light, there another, until rows of small fires gleamed along the benches. Among them, the familiar candle was placed upon a wooden desk worn smooth by years of hands and elbows. Its body was shorter now, scarred with layers of hardened wax, its wick blackened and trimmed. The spark reached it, and in an instant its flame awoke again. The light spread across the parchment before it, chasing away the shadows, and the words emerged, lines of dark ink curling in patient order, as though waiting for the scribe's hand to complete them. The monk sat, his robe gathered around him, his quill poised above the page. He bent close, the flame reflecting in his eyes, steadying his breath to match the rhythm of his hand. With each stroke, letters unfurled, tall and straight, curled and delicate, precise as though carved in stone. The candle's flame bent and lifted with the faint draft from the window, and the shadows of his fingers stretched long across the parchment. The silence was complete, save for the scratch of quill and the occasional sigh of the night wind. From time to time, the monk paused to dip the quill, the ink dark upon its tip, and in those moments he leaned closer to the light, studying the page. The candle answered with its glow, gilding each letter, making the words shimmer as if alive. Wax softened near the wick, forming a pool that quivered with each flicker. Drops slid down its sides, tracing pale rivers that cooled and hardened into ridges. A bead gathered at the rim and fell with a faint sound upon the wooden desk, leaving a mark of ivory. The monk did not notice, for his eyes were fixed upon the book, but the candle marked the hours in its slow, patient way. Outside, the night deepened. The fields lay dark beneath the stars, and the village below grew silent, its fires long extinguished. Only the monastery remained awake, its windows glowing faintly like a crown of fire upon the hill. From afar, travelers might have thought it a constellation descended to earth, a cluster of stars burning within stone walls. The monk wrote on. His quill moved as though guided by the flame itself, his letters precise, his hands steady despite weariness. Sweat beaded upon his brow. Glimmering in the light, he paused to wipe it, then leaned once more over the page. The candle's flame bent toward him, catching the faint tremor in his fingers. The furrow in his brow, the determination that held him upright when his body longed for rest. Hours passed, though he did not measure them. The parchment filled with black lines, neat and flowing, each illuminated by the candle's glow. The ink dried to a sheen, and when he lifted the book to turn the page, the flame caught upon it. Glimmering as though the letters themselves were aflame, the wax body shrank. Hollowing as it gave itself to the night, its base grew heavy with hardened folds, pale ridges that gleamed faintly. The flame bent low, then rose again, its heart blue, its crown golden, steady against the draughts that whispered through the chamber. The monk's head sagged at last, his eyes closing though, his hand still held the quill. His breath came slow, his shoulders heavy. The candle kept watch. It cast its glow upon his bowed head, upon the open page, upon the ink that shone faintly, as though it too had life. Outside, the stars wheeled in their slow procession, unseen but constant. When the bell tolled for lauds, the candle was nearly gone. Its flame wavered, its wick bent, its wax hollow. Yet it had endured the night, its light guarding the words, its warmth holding back the darkness. A hand reached, cupped, and with a breath, the flame was ended. Smoke curled upward, pale against the darkness, rising toward the rafters. Dissolving into silence, the day had been heavy, the sky swollen with clouds, the color of iron. Farmers in the valley hurried their beasts into barns. Shutters were fastened, doors barred. The air smelled of rain yet to fall, sharp and bitter, and the wind shifted in restless gusts. tugging at the cloaks of the monks as they crossed the cloister. By vespers, the sky had darkened to near night, though the sun had not yet set. Within the church, the candles were lit earlier than usual. Rows of flames sprang to life in the choir, along the nave upon the altar. Their glow was soft, but the light could not reach far, for the vast stones seemed to drink it. Shadows gathered high in the vaults, thick as storm clouds, as though the building itself felt the weight of the sky pressing down. The candle upon the altar flared as the spark touched its wick. Its flame bent low at once, troubled by the draught that slipped beneath the doors. It steadied, but not without effort, leaning and straightening as though it too breathed with unease. Wax softened quickly, dripping down its sides in uneven streams. The chants began, voices low and steady. But already the storm answered. The first thunder rolled above, a long groan that trembled through the stones. The monks did not lift their eyes, but their voices faltered, the syllables trembling with the sound. Then came the rain, striking the roof in 1,000 blows, a steady drumming that grew to a roar. The shutters rattled, wind pressed against them with force, and a faint mist slipped through cracks, dampening the air. The candle shook. Its flame bent nearly flat, a thin tongue of gold fighting against invisible hands. The wick glowed red. The wax spilled more quickly, pooling at the base in pale rivers. Around it, other candles flickered wildly, their light bending in confusion. Shadows leaping like dancers upon the walls. The storm deepened. Lightning flashed through the high windows, staining the glass with sudden fire. For an instant the saints, painted there, seemed alive, their eyes fierce, their robes bright as flame. The thunder that followed shook the arches, dust falling from hidden corners. The choir broke, voices falling into silence, and only the storm sang. The monks knelt in the nave, their hoods drawn low, their hands pressed to the stones. Some whispered prayers, their voices lost in the roar. Others simply bowed, still as statues, waiting for the fury to pass. The candle burned on, its flame wavering, but unextinguished, casting light upon the chalice, upon the book, upon the trembling hands of the priest who held them. Wax streamed down in quick rivulets, hardening in jagged ridges that gleamed when lightning flashed again. Flame bent low, then lifted, then bent again, caught in the endless struggle between breath and storm. It had endured, never vanishing, its small circle of light clinging stubbornly to the altar. Hours passed, though. No one measured them. The storm raged without, and within, the candles dwindled, their bodies shortened, their sides thick with frozen rivers of wax. The monks remained upon their knees, their voices rising again in broken chant, rising and falling like the waves of wind outside. At last the thunder lessened, the lightning came more rarely, the rain softened to a whisper. The air was damp and heavy, the stones glistened, the glass wept with condensation. The flames steadied, their trembling ceased, their glow spreading once more in peace across the church. The candle upon the altar stood scarred, its body hollowed. Its wax hardened into pale cliffs. Its flame was smaller now, but it still burned, steady once more, a sentinel against the shadows. When dawn came, the storm had gone, leaving the valley washed and silent.
Oh.
The bells tolled, their iron voices. Clear in the clean air within, the last of the night's candles were extinguished. Smoke rose in thin spirals, curling toward the vaults where echoes of thunder still seemed to linger. The altar candle burned last, its wick curled, its body short, its flame low but unwavering. Then the hand came, gentle and firm, and with a breath it was gone. The bell tolled slowly, its iron tongue striking with long pauses that sank into the valley like waves upon a shore. Each note lingered, low and heavy, carrying with it a solemn weight that silenced the fields and forests alike. From the village paths came the people, their heads bowed, their cloaks drawn tight, though the morning was calm. The monks filed into the nave, their sandals soft upon the stones, their voices hushed as though even whispers might disturb the stillness. The church was dim, the air cool with the scent of old stone and incense burned too often. Along the walls stood tall holders filled with unlit candles, pale and patient. At the altar, the familiar candle waited, its body shortened, its wax scarred with marks of many nights. Its wick was trimmed, blackened, ready. The bier was carried in, a plain wooden frame draped with a coarse cloth. Upon it lay the form of a monk, his hands folded over his chest, a wooden cross clasped within them. His face was still, pale as wax, his lips pressed together in silence that no prayer would break. The brothers lowered the bier before the altar, their heads bowed, their voices murmuring psalms that echoed faintly in the high vaults. Flame touched wick, and the altar candle awoke once more. Its glow fell across the bier, across the folded hands, across the face now, forever quiet. Shadows bent along the cloth, moving gently with the flame, as though the light itself sought. To keep vigil, other candles were lit in turn, their flames multiplying until the nave glowed with a golden hush. The monks began their chant. Their voices were low, deep, rising in waves that rolled along the stone. The words were old, older than the monastery, older than the hands that now sang them. They spoke of rest, of peace, of return to dust, of light eternal beyond the shadow, of the grave. The people joined, their tones rough but steady, until the sound filled the air like a tide. The candle burned steadily, its wax softening, flowing down in pale streams. Each drop seemed to measure the passing of a prayer, each flicker seemed to echo the breath of those who knelt nearby. Incense was brought, its smoke curling upward, wreathing the flames in silver threads. The air grew thick with its perfume, bitter and sweet, clinging to the robes, to the walls, to the still form upon the bier. The priest lifted the chalice, its silver rim catching the candlelight, scattering sparks across the altar. His hands trembled faintly, though his voice was firm, and the candle's glow touched his face, tracing the lines carved by years in silence. The choir swelled, the chants deepened, and the light of 100 flames mingled with the sound, filling the hall until even the stones seemed to resonate. The bier was raised once more, carried slowly down the nave. The candles along the path flickered, their flames bending as the procession passed. The people followed, their footsteps soft, their heads bowed, their prayers murmured. Outside, the earth waited, a narrow grave dug in the cloister garden, its soil damp, its edges sharp. The candle upon the altar burned on, alone now, its flame steady, though the hall was empty. It casts its light upon the closed book, upon the cross, upon the empty stall where the monk had once prayed. The wax dripped faster, the body hollowing, the flame bending low. When the brothers returned, their robes dusted with earth, their eyes lowered, the hall was silent. One reached forward, cupped his hand, and with a breath, the flame was ended. The smoke rose thin and straight, lingering for a long moment before fading into the vast stillness of the vaults. The candle waited in silence, its body shorter, its side scarred, its life now carrying the memory of a soul's departure. The year had been harsh. Summer's heat had burned the fields, then rain had drowned what little remained. When autumn came, the barn stood half empty, and when winter followed, hunger took its place beside the cold. The valleys lay barren, the orchards bare, the streams frozen in silence. Smoke rose thin from a few chimneys in the village, but the air smelled not of bread or stew, only of wood burned sparingly. The people came to the monastery with hollow eyes and slow steps. Mothers carried children whose faces were pale, their limbs thin, their cries weak. Fathers walked with bent shoulders, carrying nothing, for there was nothing left to carry. The monks opened the doors, though their own stores were thin, and guided the people into the church. Inside, the air was heavy with silence. The tall arches bent overhead, but no song rose to fill them. Only the sound of shuffling feet and quiet breathing lingered. Candles were brought forth, pale and slender, their sides unscarred. They were set upon the altar, upon the steps, upon the choir stalls, for light was still a gift that could be shared, even when bread could not. Among them was the familiar candle. Shorter now, its sides scarred with pale rivers hardened long ago. It was placed upon the altar once more, its wick trimmed, its body waiting. A hand reached, the spark was given, and the flame rose again. Its light spread across the hall. Casting shadows that bent over the faces of the hungry, the glow touched. Cheeks hollowed by want, eyes that no longer shone with laughter, hands clasped in weary prayer. Children stared at the flame as though it held a promise they could not name. Their faces gilded for a moment with something warmer than the cold. Around them, the monks knelt and began their chant. Their voices were low, slower than before, as though each syllable weighed heavy. The words spoke of hope, of daily bread, of mercy in the wilderness. The people joined faintly, their tones fragile, their prayers whispered through lips cracked by thirst. Together they wove a sound that trembled in the air, thin as smoke, fragile as the flame upon the altar. The candle burned steadily, its wax softening, flowing down in narrow streams. The air was cold and the drops hardened quickly, building pale ridges along its base. Its flame bent in the draught from the doors, but it lifted again, shining with quiet endurance. The hours passed. A child began to sob softly. His mother hushed him with a kiss. The old man fell asleep where he knelt, his head bowed upon his hands. A girl whispered a song she had heard at a feast long ago, her voice so faint it seemed no more than a breath. The candle listened, its flame trembling, its wax falling. Incense was lit, though little remained. The smoke curled thinly upward, less than before, but enough to sweeten the air. It mingled with the perfume of wax, bitter and faint, clinging to the walls. The people lifted their eyes toward the rising threads, and for a moment they seemed to see beyond the hunger, beyond the cold, to a stillness that promised peace. When the bell tolled, its voice was hollow, its iron weakened from years of tolling. Too often, the monks rose, their faces grave, their eyes lowered. They dismissed the people gently, guiding them back into the night, into the frozen air and the empty fields. One by one they departed, until the church was silent once more. The candle upon the altar burned alone. Its flame was small now, its wax heavy, its body shortened nearly to its end. It cast its glow upon the chalice, upon the closed book, upon the empty stalls where the monks had knelt. The silence pressed in, vast and unbroken. At last, a hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath, the flame was gone. The smoke rose, thin and pale, mingling with the cold air, lingering for a moment, before vanishing into the dark. The candle waited once more. Scarred by hunger, marked by silence, bearing the memory of the night when light was all the comfort that could be given. The roads had been long and harsh, stretching across hills and valleys, through fields barren and forests dark. For days pilgrims had walked, their feet wrapped in rags, their shoulders bent beneath the weight of satchels, their lips cracked by sun and wind. They carried staffs cut from hedgerow wood, rosaries of bone and wood, relics bound in cloth. Some had journeyed alone, others in groups, but all came with the same burden, the hope of mercy. By evening they reached the hill. The monastery rose above them, its walls dark against the fading sky, its towers faintly outlined against the last fire of sunset. The bells began to toll, their voices deep and welcoming, though heavy with the memory of many years. The pilgrims quickened their pace, though their legs trembled, their steps faltered. At the gates they paused, their hands upon their hearts, their eyes lifted as though the stones themselves might grant blessing. Then they entered. Within the church preparations had been made. Benches had been cleared, mats laid upon the stone floors, braziers lit to hold back the chill of spring's evening. But the true warmth awaited in silence, rows upon rows of candles unlit, their pale bodies standing tall along the nave. Upon the steps of the altar, before the images of saints, they were patient, still expectant. The monks moved quietly among the pilgrims, guiding them to kneel, to bow, to rest. The air was filled with the sound of weary breathing, of cloaks rustling, of staffs laid aside. Then the first spark touched wick, and the darkness gave way. One flame, then another. The light spread from the altar outward, each candle sharing its fire with its neighbor. Soon the nave glowed with 1,000 points of gold. Shadows retreated into the arches, climbing high until they were swallowed by the vaults. Faces, lined with travel and sorrow, were gilded with sudden warmth. Children's eyes widened at the sight, their mouths open in awe, their small hands clasping tightly the hands of their mothers. The familiar candle stood among them upon the altar, its body shorter now, its sides scarred with rivers of hardened wax. Yet its flame rose as steady as any, gleaming upon the chalice, upon the great book opened before the priest. Its glow mingled with the sea of fire, no longer solitary, but part of a multitude. As though it had found its brethren, the chants began. Deeper and louder than usual, for the voices of monks were joined by those of pilgrims. Their tones were rough, uneven, yet filled with fervor. Together they rose into the arches, filling the space with sound like the rolling of waves. Incense was lit, thick and sweet, its smoke curling through the light, turning the air into a haze of gold and silver. The candle burned, its flame bending with each draught, its wax flowing faster in the warmth of so many companions. The drops hardened along its sides, building ridges that caught the light like pale carvings. Its flame wavered when the doors opened and more pilgrims entered. But it steadied again, refusing to yield. Prayers were spoken aloud, some in voices trembling, others in voices strong. Men lifted their arms, women pressed their foreheads too. The stone children whispered words half-remembered. All faces turned toward the altar, toward the flames, toward the hope that light might carry their pleas beyond the darkness. The hours passed. Outside, the night deepened. The fields lay silent. The stars wheeled above, unseen. Within, the candles glowed without weariness, their flames flickering in rhythm with the psalms. The pilgrims shifted upon the stones, some sleeping where they knelt, others watching the flames as though afraid they might vanish. The familiar candle burned lower, its wax pooling at its base, its body hollowing, yet it did not falter. It cast its light upon the tired faces, upon the open hands, upon the silent tears that glimmered like pearls in its glow. It bore witness to prayers unending, to faith that lingered though the body failed. At last, the bell tolled again. Chants grew softer, the incense thinned, the voices fell one by one into silence. The pilgrims lay upon the stones in rest, their heads upon cloaks, their bodies curled in weariness. The monks moved among them quietly, extinguishing flames one by one, until only the altar candle remained. It burned alone once more, its flame steady, its wax nearly gone. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath the light vanished. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the perfume of incense, rising into the vaults until it was lost among the shadows. The candle waited again, shorter than ever, bearing within it the memory of 1,000 voices raised beneath its light. The cloisters were silent, heavy with the stillness of night. Only the distant cry of an owl drifted through the arches, and the soft rustle of the wind stirred the ivy along the stone. A monk walked slowly, his hands folded around a candle whose flame bent and lifted with each step. The wax dripped upon the iron holder, pale beads cooling in silence as he moved toward the infirmary. The door creaked as he entered. The air inside was close, carrying the mingled scents of herbs and damp linen. Straw rustled beneath sandals as the brothers shifted, at their work, tending those who lay upon narrow cots. Some moaned softly, some coughed, others lay still, their faces pale and hollow. The smoke of a single brazier curled upward, filling the chamber with a faint haze. The candle was set upon a small wooden table beside one bed. Its flame stretched upward, casting its glow across the form of a monk who lay with eyes half closed, his breath shallow, his hands trembling upon the blanket. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, his brow wet with fever. He turned faintly at the light, his gaze settling upon it, as though finding in its glow something more than fire. The attending brother bent low, whispering words of prayer. dipped a cloth into a bowl of cool water, pressed it against the sick man's brow. The candle flickered, its flame bending to each movement, gilding the wet lines upon his skin, the hollow of his cheeks, the fragile tremor of his lips. The night deepened. Other monks came and went, carrying jugs, adjusting blankets, murmuring psalms. The candle burned steadily, its wax softening, flowing down in narrow streams that hardened into ridges upon its base. Its light stretched across the chamber, catching the curve of bowls, the glimmer of brass instruments, the outlines of bodies upon their cots. It gilded the weary faces of those who kept vigil, their eyes shadowed with exhaustion, yet steady with resolve. At times the sick man stirred, whispering fragments of prayers, words broken by coughs. At times he lay still, his breath shallow, his chest rising and falling faintly in the glow. The candle bore witness, its flame trembling but unyielding, marking each moment with the slow fall of wax. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly upon the shutters. The sound mingled with the rustle of straw, the sighs of sleepers, the low chants of monks. The candle's flame bent to the draught from the door, then rose again, steady against the chill. The hours passed. One by one, the other candles in the room burned low, their flames shrinking, their smoke curling upward as they were extinguished. Yet the altar candle, scarred, shortened, patient, remained, its flame still steady beside the sick man's bed. When dawn approached, pale light crept through the shutters. The sick man's breath grew weaker, his lips moved faintly, shaping a final prayer no one could hear. His hands stilled upon the blanket, his eyes closed, and his body sank into silence. The candle burned on, its flame steady, casting its light upon the folded hands, upon the face now quiet, upon the shadows retreating into corners. The attending brother crossed himself, bowed his head, and whispered words of release. At last a hand reached. 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath the light was ended. The smoke rose, curling upward in silence, mingling with the pale dawn. The candle waited once more, scarred with the memory of breath fading into stillness, marked by the vigil it had kept through the night. The day had been long with toil. Fields rustled with barley not yet ripe. The village paths were worn with footsteps, and smoke from a dozen hearths lingered above the thatched roofs. Yet as evening neared, a hush fell. The bells began to toll, slow and steady, summoning all to leave their work, to gather with cloaks and lanterns and voices ready for prayer. At the monastery gates the people gathered, faces lit with anticipation. Women carried baskets of herbs to scatter upon the path. Men bore wooden crosses adorned with sprigs of evergreen. Children clutched small clay lamps. The monks emerged, their habits dark against the pale sky, carrying before them a great crucifix, and chanting softly, voices weaving like threads of smoke. From the sacristy came the candles. Dozens were lifted from their shelves, each slender body pale in the fading light. Among them was the familiar one, scarred and shortened, its sides marked by rivers of wax, long hardened. It was set within a brass lantern, its wick trimmed, its body steady, awaiting the spark. The flame was given, and the lantern glowed. Its light spread across the faces of those nearby, warming their hollow cheeks, gleaming upon their eyes. Children stared wide-eyed, their reflections dancing in the glass. The procession began. The gates opened, and the monks led the way, chanting in slow rhythm. Behind them came the villagers, their steps measured, their voices low. The path wound down the hill, through fields silvered by moonlight. The lanterns swayed with each step, their lights bobbing like stars come to earth. The candle burned within its brass frame, its flame steady, though the night wind pressed against the glass. Herbs were scattered upon the ground, their scent rising as feet crushed them. Thyme, rosemary, lavender. The air filled with perfume mingled with the smell of smoke and wax. The chants echoed in the stillness, answered only by the low sigh of wind across the meadows. The candle's glow mingled with the smaller lights around it, forming a river of gold that wound down the dark road. Children began to sing, their voices high and clear, weaving above the monk's chant. Old men hummed, women joined, and soon the valley rang with sound. It was not loud, not joyous, but steady, patient, like the slow beating of a heart. The flames wavered with each note, but none were extinguished. The procession wound through the village. Doors opened, windows lifted, faces appeared in the glow. Some knelt as the cross passed, some crossed themselves, some joined the line, carrying their own lamps. The path grew brighter, the sound deeper, till it seemed the whole valley moved together in a single flow of light and voice. The candle burned steadily. Its wax melted, dripped, cooled along the lantern's base. Its flame bent when the wind grew sharp, then rose again, reflected 100-fold in the glass panes carried by others. It cast its glow upon the faces around it, faces lined with age, marked with care, yet softened in that moment by something greater. At the village square, the procession halted. A wooden platform had been raised, draped with simple cloth. Upon it the crucifix was set, and before it the candles were gathered. Lanterns were opened, wicks touched, and soon the platform blazed. With light, a familiar candle stood among them, its flame one voice in a choir of fire. The chants grew louder. The bells in the monastery tower rang again, their iron voices rolling down the valley. The people knelt, their hands folded, their heads bowed. Children lay their lamps at the platform's edge, their small flames joining the greater. The square glowed. The night transformed into day, not of the sun, but of devotion. The candle upon the platform burned low, its wax pooling, its flame bending, its body hollowing. Yet it shone as though it would never end, casting light upon the crucifix, upon the bowed heads, upon the tears glistening in the eyes of those who prayed. When the last chant faded and the bells fell silent, the monks moved among the candles. One by one they were extinguished, their smoke curling into the night. The people rose, gathered their children, and turned homeward, their voices hushed once more. The familiar candle burned last. Its flame bent low, then lifted, then bent again, as though reluctant to depart. At last, fingers reached, and with a breath the light was gone. The smoke rose, mingling with the perfume of crushed herbs and the cool air of night drifting upward, until it vanished among the stars. The candle waited in silence, carrying within it the memory of a valley bathed in light. Of voices joined as one, of shadows scattered for a single night. The bells rang in a tone not of mourning, nor of penance, nor of festival, but of joy, though even joy in those days was clothed in solemnity. Their iron tongues swung high above the valley, their voices spreading across the fields and woods, summoning the people as they always did. But on this day the summons was different. For a man and a woman were to be joined, not in the fields, not before the hearth of their cottage, but before the altar within the monastery church. The villagers gathered early, their garments washed and mended, their hair brushed, their faces washed clean in cold water from the wells. Mothers braided the hair of their daughters with sprigs of rosemary and thyme. Fathers set small garlands upon their sons' heads. Children clutched handfuls of wildflowers, their petals trembling in the morning air. The path to the monastery filled with their steps, their laughter hushed but present. A soft ripple of sound rising beneath the solemn peal of the bells. Within the church, the monks had prepared. The floor had been swept, the benches arranged, the altar dressed in linen, embroidered with careful hands. Upon it lay a single chalice, polished until it shone, and a great book bound in leather, its clasps gleaming. Along the steps and in the choir candles had been placed, slender, pale, their wicks trimmed. Mating in silence, among them was the familiar candle, scarred and shortened, its body no longer smooth but ridged with frozen rivers of wax. It was set upon the altar once more, the place it had known so many times. A hand reached, and the spark was given. Its flame rose steady, casting its glow across the cloth, the chalice. The cross above the people entered, filling the nave. Steps echoed against the stone, their whispers hushed in the vastness. The bride and groom stood at the doors, their hands clasped, their eyes lowered. The bride wore a gown of simple wool, but upon her head rested a wreath of flowers, fresh and fragrant. The groom wore a tunic of homespun, but a sprig of green was fastened at his breast. Together, they walked the length of the nave, their steps measured, their faces pale with reverence. The monks began their chant, low and steady. Their voices rose to the vaults, mingling with the glow of the candles. Incense was lit, its smoke, curling upward, filling the air with perfumes sweet and sharp. The bride and groom knelt before the altar, the light falling across their faces, gilding their bowed heads, glimmering upon the wreath, upon the sprig, upon their joined hands. The priest spoke, his words solemn, his voice echoing among the arches. He spoke of love not as joy alone, but as burden, as vow, as labor shared. The couple repeated his words, their voices trembling but clear. The candle burned, its flame steady, its wax falling in slow streams, each drop like the beat of a heart. When the vows were spoken, the priest raised the chalice. The light caught upon its rim, scattering sparks across the altar. The couple bowed their heads, their eyes closed, their lips moving in silent prayer. The people behind them crossed themselves, their breath sighing like wind through leaves. Choir swelled. The monks' voices deepened. The people joined and the church was filled with sound. Children scattered their flowers upon the stones, their petals falling like quiet rain. The candle's flame trembled in the draught, then lifted. As though in answer to the song, at last the priest lowered his hands, and the couple rose. They turned to face the people, their fingers still entwined. For a moment the light fell fully upon their faces, gilding them with radiance not of sun, but of flame. The people murmured softly, smiles breaking through the solemnity. The bells rang again, brighter this time, their voices rolling across the valley. The people filed out, their laughter now louder, their voices freer. The couple followed, walking, hand in hand into the daylight, into the world awaiting them. Within the church, the candles still burned. Their flames bent low, their bodies shortened, their wax scarred. The familiar candle upon the altar burned lower than the rest, its flame smaller, its sides heavy with hardened streams. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath, it was gone. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the perfume of flowers left behind. Rising into the still air of the church, until it was lost among the arches, the candle waited again, bearing the memory of a vow spoken in its glow. 2 lives joined beneath its flame, of joy clothed in solemn silence. The church stood silent beneath the cloak of night. Outside, the valley slept, its fields silvered by moonlight, its cottages dark, its hearths cold. Only the monastery glowed faintly, a crown of pale light resting upon the hill. The faint hum of voices within the cloisters carrying on the wind. At the great doors, a figure knelt. His armor was plain yet strong, its steel dulled by years of service, its edges marked by dents and scratches that spoke of battles past. A sword hung at his side, its hilt wrapped in worn leather, its pummel shining faintly in the moonlight. Upon his shoulders lay a cloak of deep crimson, frayed at the hem, clasped with a simple brooch of iron. His head was bare, his hair cropped short, his face lined with years, his eyes heavy with thought. The monks opened the doors, their sandals whispering against stone. They bowed slightly and led him inside. Followed without word, his steps measured, the echo of his boots ringing against the nave. The church was dim, its tall arches lost in shadow, its stained glass windows dark without the sun. Along the steps of the altar stood rows of candles unlit, their pale bodies waiting in silence. From the sacristy came the familiar candle, shortened, scarred, its sides marked with rivers of hardened wax. It was placed upon the altar once more, its wick trimmed, its body waiting. Spark touched it, and the flame rose, bending upward, gilding the chalice, the cross, the book bound in leather that lay open upon the altar. The knight knelt before it, his hands resting upon the hilt of his sword, his head bowed. The candle's flame bent in the draught of his breath, then steadied, casting its light upon the steel of his armor, upon the lines of his face, upon the eyes that now closed in prayer. The monks began their chant, low and steady, a hum that rose and fell like the beating of a distant drum. The knight did not join, but remained silent, his lips unmoving, his breath deep. Within his chest, his heart beat heavily, its rhythm slow but strong, each thud like a hammer upon an anvil. The candle burned, its wax softening, flowing in slow rivulets that hardened into pale ridges. Each drop seemed to measure the passage of thought, the silent words unspoken within the night's heart. The flame trembled faintly, casting long shadows across the nave, shadows that bent and swayed like figures unseen. Hours passed. The monks withdrew to their cloisters, their chants fading into silence, their sandals soft upon the stones. The knight remained alone, his vigil unbroken. The candle kept watch beside him, its glow steady upon his bowed head, upon the sword resting before him, upon the shield propped against the step. He raised his eyes at last, gazing into the flame. His breath trembled, his lips parted, and words came forth low and broken, words of confession, of fear, of hope. He spoke of the battles behind him, of the brothers he had lost, of the weight of blood upon his hands. He spoke of the battle yet to come, of the dawn that would summon him to the field, of the vow he had sworn to keep. The candle listened. Its flame bent low, then lifted, as though answering in silence. Its wax fell more quickly now, scarred and uneven, yet its light did not waver. It touched the steel of the sword, gleaming faintly. It glowed upon the cross of the altar. It lingered upon the knight's eyes, wet with tears not shed in battle. The night deepened. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, the stars wheeled across the heavens, unseen. Within, the church remained still. The only sound, the faint crackle of the candle's flame and the knight's slow, steady breathing. At last he rose. He lifted. The sword kissed its hilt and laid it upon the altar. The candle's light fell across the steel, making it gleam as though it were alive. The knight bowed deeply, then turned and walked down the nave, his steps heavy, his cloak trailing. The candle burned on, its flame steady, its wax nearly gone. When the monks returned at dawn, they found it low, its body hollowed, its flame bending faintly. One reached forward, cupped his hand, and with a breath ended the light. The smoke rose thin and straight, curling upward into the high arches. Mingling with the silence of the empty church, the candle waited once more, bearing the memory of a night when a warrior's heart had bent before its flame, the snows had melted from the cloisters, and water dripped steadily from the eaves into the garden wells. Green pushed up between the stones of the courtyard, shy blades trembling in the breeze. Beyond the monastery walls, orchards swelled with blossoms. The fields were dotted with lambs, whose bleats echoed faintly across the hills. Spring had returned, soft and slow, and with it came a lifting of voices. The scriptorium, long chilled by winter draughts, now breathed with gentler air. The windows were unshuttered, and light of the moon spilled silver upon the floor, though the corners still kept their shadows. Wooden desks lined the chamber, each crowded with parchment, ink, and sharpened quills. But this night the scribes were not bent over scripture alone. They had gathered to copy the songs of the church, to set down the notes of chant upon lined pages so that new voices might one day rise with old ones. Candles were lit. One by one their flames trembled into being, filling the long hall with a warm glow that mingled with the moonlight. Among them was the familiar candle, shortened, scarred, its body thick with frozen streams of wax. It was set upon a desk at the center of the chamber, its flame bending upward, casting its circle of gold across parchment still empty. The monks took their seats, their habits rustling softly. Quills were lifted, inkpots uncorked, and silence fell, save for the faint crackle of flames. Then a single voice began, low and steady, chanting the first line of a hymn. Another joined, then another, until the chamber swelled with harmony. A living pattern of sound that filled the arches and seemed to rest upon the stones themselves. The candle's flame bent and lifted with the voices, trembling faintly with each breath, steadying again as the song grew strong. Its light gleamed upon the quills, upon the ink-stained fingers, upon the neat black marks that appeared one by one across the parchment. Lines, notes, words. Each stroke was guided by the flame's glow. Each curve caught its reflection, each page filled with the living echo of voices around it. Wax softened, slid, hardened again. A drop fell upon the desk, leaving a pale bead beside the edge of the parchment. The scribe did not pause, his quill steady as he traced the notes, but the candle marked the moment, one drop for one phrase, one flicker for one breath of chant. The night deepened. Outside, the orchards glimmered faintly beneath the moon, their blossoms shifting in the wind. Inside, the song continued, unbroken, flowing from lips to page, from memory to ink. The candle burned, its flame unyielding, casting light that turned shadow into pattern, silence into music. From time to time, a voice faltered, weary with the hour, but others rose to carry the line. The chant never ceased, rolling like a tide. Through the chamber, candle bent low, when the drafts entered through the open window, then lifted again, steady as the song itself. By midnight, pages lay filled, their black lines and careful notes glowing beneath the flame. The monks laid them aside, their hands trembling with fatigue, their voices hoarse. Yet still they sang, softly now, a final hymn of thanks. The candle's flame caught the sheen of wet ink, turning it to silver, as though the music itself shone. Upon the page, at last the voices fell silent. Quills were set aside, parchment stacked, inkpots closed. The monks crossed themselves, bowed their heads, and withdrew to their cells. The scriptorium grew still. Only the candles remained there. Flames low, their wax heavy. The familiar candle burned smaller than the rest, its flame bending faintly, its body hollowed. Yet it glowed upon the parchment, upon the notes and words that would carry song into days yet to come. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and the light was ended. The smoke rose, pale against the moonlight, curling upward until it vanished. Among the beams, the candle waited again, bearing the memory of a night when voices and fire had written music into silence. The moon was full, rising, vast and pale above the hills, casting her silver gaze across the fields and the quiet roofs of the village. The air was soft with the scent of spring grass, damp with dew, and stirred only by the faintest wind. The bells called, their voices slower than for feast, gentler than for mourning, echoing through the valley like ripples across water. The villagers answered, leaving their hearths and cottages, carrying lanterns, carrying torches, carrying nothing but their voices and the weight of the season. The monastery's courtyard had been prepared. Benches of rough wood were set along the cloisters. Herbs scattered upon the flagstones, and a long table stood beneath the open sky. Upon it rested icons and books, draped in cloth, surrounded by rows of candles, each pale and waiting. Moved silently, their habits stirring against stone, their heads bowed, their lips shaping quiet prayers. Among the candles stood the familiar one, scarred by countless nights, shortened, its body hardened into ridges of frozen wax. It was set at the center of the table, in a brass holder polished until it gleamed beneath the moonlight. A hand reached, a spark was given, and the flame rose once more, golden against the silver light of the night. Asterisk, the people gathered. Mothers, with children drowsy in their arms, fathers with cloaks about their shoulders, elders leaning upon staffs, seated themselves upon benches, upon the grass, upon the stones still warm from the day's sun. Their voices hushed, their eyes lifted to the flame that shone at the heart of the gathering. The chant began, low and steady. The monks' voices blended with the hush of the night, weaving with the sigh of wind through trees. The villagers joined, their tones uneven but fervent, until the courtyard was filled with sound. The moonlight poured upon them, silver and still, while the candles' glow cast circles of warmth, the 2 lights mingling gold within silver, earth within sky. The wax softened, flowed, hardened. The flame bent in the faint wind, then straightened again, unwavering. Its glow touched the pages of the book upon the table, catching the letters inked long ago, making them shimmer. It gilded the carved lines of the icons, the folds of the monks' habits, the faces of the children who gazed upward with wide, unblinking eyes. Hours passed, yet no one moved to leave. The voices rose and fell, Prayers whispered, psalms intoned, hymns carried upon the night air. Shadows shifted across the cloisters, bending with the flames. The moon sailed high above, her light cold and distant, while the candle burned steady, its warmth near and close. From time to time, the chant faded, and silence reigned. In those moments, the only sound was the crackle of flame, the distant rustle of leaves, the faint cry of night birds. The people breathed together, their faces turned toward the candle, as though its small fire bound them to one another. As though its flame were the heart of their gathering, the candle burned lower, its body shrank, its wax heavy at the base. Its flame smaller, yet no less steady. The children slept upon their mothers' laps. The elders leaned heavily upon their staffs. The fathers bowed their heads. The monks still sang. At last the bell tolled again, its voice deep and final. The chant faded. The people crossed themselves, rose slowly, gathered their children, their cloaks, their staffs. They turned toward the gates, their footsteps soft upon the stones. Their voices hushed once more. The courtyard grew empty. The monks remained, extinguishing the flames one by one. Smoke rose, pale against the moonlight, curling upward in thin threads, lingering before vanishing into the silver air. The familiar candle burned last. Its flame bent, lifted, trembled. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath the light was gone. The smoke drifted, mingling with the breath of spring, rising toward the moon until it dissolved into her silver gaze. The candle waited again, bearing within it the memory of a night when earth and sky, fire and moon, voice and silence had gathered as one. The bells did not call with joy. No, their sound was sharper, more insistent, each stroke quickened, echoing through the valley like the beating of a restless heart. The villagers left their fields, their workshops, their hearths, and came slowly to the monastery, whispering among themselves. Something solemn, something heavy awaited within. The church was dim, its windows shuttered against the morning light. Inside, the air was cool, smelling of old incense, wood, and stone. At the center of the nave, benches had been set in rows. At the altar, a great table stood, draped with plain cloth, upon which lay a book bound in leather, a cross of iron, and a small bell. Candles had been placed along the table's edge, their pale bodies waiting. Among them was the familiar candle. Scarred by many nights, shortened, its sides thick, with hardened streams. It was lifted from the sacristy, placed at the center of the table, and lit. Its flame rose, bending once, then steadying. Casting a circle of gold across the book, the cross, and the faces of those who gathered. The villagers filled the benches, their voices hushed, their eyes restless. The monks entered in procession, their habits dark, their heads bowed. The abbot took his place at the table, his hands folded, his face stern. The accused was brought forward, a man from the village, his wrists bound with rope, his head lowered. His eyes flickered toward the flame, then fell again to the floor. The candle's glow touched each face the solemn abbot. The weary monks, the villagers whispering in the shadows, the man trembling in the center. It revealed lines of fear, of judgment, of sorrow, and of silence. Shadows stretched long across the stones, bending with each flicker of flame, as though the very walls leaned closer to listen. The abbot spoke. His voice was low but firm, each word measured, falling into the silence like stones into still water. I read from the book, his eyes steady, his hands unmoving. The man raised his head, his lips trembling, words spilling forth in broken protest, in hurried explanation. The people murmured, their voices rising, then falling again into stillness as the abbot lifted his hand. The candle burned, its wax softening, dripping, hardening into ridges that gleamed faintly. Each drop marked a heartbeat, each flicker echoed the unspoken tension in the air. Its flame bent when the man's voice broke into sobs, lifted when the abbot replied, steady when silence returned. Hours passed. Witnesses spoke, their voices uncertain. Monks recited scripture, their tones unwavering. The people shifted upon their benches, their eyes moving between the accused and the flame. Some clasped their hands, whispering prayers. Others frowned, their brows furrowed with judgment. The candle's light gilded the iron cross, making it gleam as though alive. It shone upon the bell, which trembled when struck, its small voice sharp in the vast hall. It lingered upon the abbot's hands, steady upon the table, upon the prisoner's face wet with tears. When at last the abbot rose, silence deepened. His words fell heavy, final, leaving no space for reply. The man bowed his head, his shoulders sagging, his voice stilled. The people crossed themselves, some sighing, some nodding, some looking away. The monks lowered their eyes. The candle burned lower, its body nearly gone, its wax pooling at its base. Its flame wavered faintly but did not falter. It cast its last glow upon the man as he was led away, upon the abbot closing the book, upon the villagers rising slowly from their benches. One by one, the candles were extinguished. Smoke rose in pale threads, curling upward into the arches, lingering in the silence. The familiar candle burned last, its flame bending low, its wick curled. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and the light was ended. The valley had ripened. Under the weight of summer, fields bent heavy with barley and wheat, their heads bowed as though in prayer. Orchards swelled with apples blushing red, vineyards glimmered with grapes. And the air was filled with the scent of earth grown fat with promise. Yet with promise came fear. A storm could strip the fields in a night, a fire could turn the barns to ash, a pestilence could spoil the fruit. So, before the first sickle touched the stalks, the people gathered to pray, to watch, to hope. The monastery bells called them. Their iron voices rang in slow rhythm, rolling across the hills, steady as the breath of the earth itself. From cottages and farmsteads, the people came in with hands calloused from plows, women with aprons stained by grain, children with hair smelling of sun and hay. They carried baskets of fruit, jars of honey, loaves of coarse bread, offerings laid upon the altar in gratitude and in fear. The church was dim, cool, after the day's heat. The air smelled of herbs hung to dry, of stone damp with evening, of incense clinging to pillars. Upon the altar stood the candles, tall and pale, their wicks trimmed, their bodies waiting. Among them was the familiar candle, shorter now, its sides ridged with wax hardened long ago, was placed at the center. Its wick touched, its flame rising steady and clear. The people filled the nave, their voices hushed. They knelt upon the stones, their baskets laid before them, their heads bowed. The monks entered in procession, their chant low, weaving through the arches, echoing like the murmur of wind in ripe fields. The flame bent toward the sound, then steadied, casting its glow upon the offerings, fruit gleaming, honey shining, bread golden though coarse. The wax softened, slid, hardened. The flame trembled faintly as the doors closed, then steadied again, gilding the chalice, the cross, the hands of the priest, as he raised them high. His voice spoke of sowing and reaping, of toil and gift, of life drawn from earth by sweat and silence. The people answered in murmurs, their words rough but fervent. Children stared at the flame, their eyes wide, their hands clutching at their mother's skirts. Hours passed. Psalms rose, fell, rose again. The incense thickened, curling in silver streams that mingled with the golden glow. The air grew heavy, yet none moved. The farmers prayed for rain not too much, for sun not too hot, for wind not too strong. The mothers prayed for barns filled, for children fed. The old prayed for strength to last until the harvest was done. The candle listened. Its flame bent and lifted, marking each prayer, each sigh, each silent vow. Its wax flowed faster in the warmth of so many bodies, dripping, hardening, building pale ridges at its base. Its body grew shorter, its light smaller, but it endured, casting its circle upon the altar, upon the bowed heads, upon the faces wet with tears shed in hope and in fear. At midnight, the bells tolled again. The people did not leave, but remained, their voices joining once more in chant. The sound rose into the arches, mingled with the rustle of wind through the fields beyond. It was as though the earth itself joined their prayer, as though the fields bent not only with grain but with reverence. Toward dawn, the chants softened, the incense thinned, the people grew still. Some slept where they knelt, their heads upon their arms, their children curled against their sides. The monks moved quietly among them, keeping vigil, their lips shaping prayers unending. The familiar candle burned low, its wax hollowed, its flame bent faintly, its wick curled. It shone until the first light of dawn slipped through the high windows, pale and cold. For a moment dawn and flame mingled, day and night clasped hands upon the altar. Then a hand reached, 2 fingers. Pinched, and with a breath the light was gone. The smoke curled upward. Thin and straight, mingling with the new day's air, the candle waited again. Scarred and shortened, bearing the memory of a night when a whole valley laid its harvest in silence. Before its flame. Frost crept early across the valley that year. Even before the leaves had fallen, the mornings grew sharp, the fields white, the wells crusted with ice. Smoke rose thin from chimneys, but the smell was not of abundance. Wood was scarce, stores meager, and the people looked to the long months. Ahead, with worry hidden behind quiet eyes, the bells called them on the first night of frost. Their iron tongues swung slowly, each toll lingering, heavy with foreboding yet steady with resolve. From cottages and farmsteads the people came, cloaks wrapped close, breath rising like pale clouds. Children were led by the hand, their steps small and hesitant, while elders leaned upon staffs, their faces lined deeper by the bite of cold. The monastery gates opened wide. Within, the church was dark, colder than the fields outside. The stones seemed to drink the warmth of breath, and silence hung thick. But upon the altar stood the candles, waiting. Rows of pale bodies, their wicks blackened or fresh, their sides smooth or scarred. Among them stood the familiar candle, shorter than most, its body thick with hardened ridges, its wick trimmed once more. A hand reached. A spark touched, and its flame awoke again. The glow spread softly, pushing back the cold shadows. Its circle of gold touched the chalice, the cross, the linen cloth upon the altar, bowed heads of monks who entered in slow procession. The people knelt, their cloaks rustling faintly. Their voices were hushed, their hands clasped, their lips whispering prayers. The abbot lifted his voice, low and solemn, speaking of winter, of trials, of endurance. He spoke of the earth resting in silence, of seeds sleeping beneath frost, of hope hidden in stillness. His words rolled through the nave like distant thunder, heavy yet steady. The candle burned, its wax softening, dripping in thin rivulets that hardened quickly in the cold air. Its flame bent low and the doors opened, to admit more villagers, then steadied, casting its glow upon their pale faces. Upon the baskets they carried small offerings of apples, of nuts, of bread saved from the last harvest. Incense was lit, and the smoke rose in coils, white against the dark arches. It mingled with the breath of the people, with the mist of the cold, until the air itself seemed made of drifting threads. The flame pierced through, steady, unwavering. A small sun in a night of frost. The chants began, slower than in times of feast, but deep, resonant. The monks' voices echoed, joined by the villagers, rough and uneven but true. Together they wove sound that filled the arches, wrapping the stone in warmth no fire could bring. Children leaned against their mothers' eyes, half closed, lulled by the steady rhythm. The old wept silently, their tears glimmering faintly in the glow. Hours passed, though none counted. The cold deepened, creeping through the stones, yet the people did not leave. They remained in vigil, their prayers whispered, their eyes fixed. Upon the altar where the flames stood guard, the familiar candle burned lower, its sides scarred anew, its flame smaller yet no less steady. Toward dawn, the abbot lifted the cross high. His voice rang stronger, speaking of spring that would come, though none could see it, of light that would endure, though darkness pressed long. The people bowed their heads, murmuring assent, clinging to words as to warmth. The bells tolled once. More, softer now, their voices fading into the pale morning. The monks moved among the candles, extinguishing them one by one. Smoke rose in thin spirals, mingling with the breath of dawn, filling the arches with pale haze. The familiar candle burned last. Its flame bent low, its wick curled, its wax hollow. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath the light was gone. The smoke lingered longer than before, curling upward, drifting slowly, as though reluctant to leave. The candle waited, once more, bearing within it the memory of a night when cold pressed close. And yet warmth was found in a flame no larger than a breath. The library of the monastery was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that holds its breath. The stone walls guarded against the winter winds, yet the chill still crept in through every crack. Shelves of dark oak bent under the weight of manuscripts, their bindings worn smooth by the touch of centuries. On a long table, scattered with parchment and quills, the candle was set once more into its brass holder. A hand brought the spark, and at once the small flame lifted, golden against the vast gloom. Its light spilled outward, kissing the edges of vellum, awakening lines of script. Faded with age, it fell upon jars of ink, upon the curve of sharpened quills, upon the hands of a young monk bent low over his task. His eyes, weary yet steady, glimmered in the halo of light as he pressed words into the page. The scratch of his pen was soft, almost swallowed by the silence, yet it filled the chamber like the murmur of unseen wings. The candle bent in the draught that slid beneath the door, then straightened again, patient, enduring. Wax softened near its crown, and slow drops slid down, carving pale streams along its side, freezing in mid-descent. Shadows stretched long across the walls, distorted into figures that seemed to lean closer, as if listening. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow hurled itself against the shutters with hollow fists, and the wind howled through the cloisters, carrying with it the cry of the night. But here, in this circle of light, the storm was powerless. The monks worked on, turning pages, dipping quills, their lips moving in silent prayers as they copied words that had outlived kings and empires. The air grew heavy with the mingling of smoke and ink. Motes danced in the glow, each one flashing briefly like a star, before vanishing into shadow. The candle's flame flickered, but it held. The light fell upon words of psalms, of hymns, stories once carried by voices, and now captured forever upon skin and parchment. Hours slipped away unnoticed. The storm raged and waned beyond the walls, but within the chamber, only the circle of gold remained. When at last the bell tolled for rest, the monks set down their quills. Fingers closed the heavy books, parchments were gathered into neat piles. The candle burned still, though low now, its body scarred. Its flame bent faintly, as though weary. A hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and the flame was gone. Mist smoke rose in a thin line, curling upward, drifting into the beams of the ceiling until it vanished. Its darkness returned, swallowing shelves and manuscripts. Yet upon the fresh pages the memory of the light lingered, lines of black ink, live with the breath of a flame that had kept the night at bay. The refectory was vast and bare, its stone floor worn smooth by centuries of sandals, its wooden benches polished by the weight of countless meals. The air inside carried the faint scent of smoke and boiled grains, mingled with the sharper Thames. Of dried fish. Outside, the winter night pressed close, the shutters rattled by wind, but within, the monks gathered in silence, their hoods drawn, their hands folded. Upon the long table at the center, the candle was set once more into its iron stand. A spark touched its wick, and the flame leapt into being, golden and small, yet strong enough to push the shadows back into the corners. Its glow stretched along the table, across wooden bowls and earthen cups, across the pale hands of brothers, who took their places without a word. The meal began. Bread, dark and coarse, was broken into pieces. A thin stew was ladled from a great pot, steaming faintly in the cold air. No voice rose save that of the lector, a monk who stood at the end of the hall, a book open in his hands. By the light of another candle, he read aloud from Scripture, his voice measured and steady, echoing among the arches. The monks ate in silence, each movement quiet, The only sounds the rustle of cloth, the scrape of wooden spoons against bowls, the steady cadence of words flowing from the lector's lips. The candle burned at the heart of it all, its flame bending faintly with each draught from the door, its wax softening, dripping down in pale streams that hardened into ridges upon the iron stand. Shadows leaned across the benches, across the bowed heads, across the faces intent upon the food and upon the words being read. The flame gilded the curve of the chalice at the abbot's place, glimmered upon the pages of the open book, touched the steam that rose in delicate threads from bowls. Each flicker marked the passing of moments, each fall of wax measured the slow unfolding of the meal when the bowls were emptied. When the bread was gone, when the lector closed the book with a soft thud, the monks folded their hands in prayer. Their lips moved together, a low murmur that rose and fell like the breathing of the sea. The candle trembled in the draught of their voices, then steadied again, its flame bright against the silence that followed. One by one, the monks rose and left the hall, their steps soft upon the stones, figures vanishing into the dark of the cloisters. The benches stood empty, the bowls stacked, the air filled only with the fading warmth of bodies and the faint scent of wax. The candle burned alone, its flame smaller now, its wax hollowing, yet still it shone as though unwilling. To surrender at last a hand reached. Fingers cupped the flame, and with a breath it was gone. Smoke curled upward, drifting lazily, dissolving into the high beams of the hall. Darkness returned, the benches swallowed, the bowls unseen, the silence complete. The candle waited once. More scarred by another night, carrying within it the memory of bread broken, words spoken, and silence deeper than hunger. The cloister lay open to the night, its arches framing the sky where stars burned cold and sharp. The stone walkways glistened with frost, and the garden at its center lay still. The herbs long withered, the fountain frozen into silence. The monks walked slowly, their sandals whispering on the stones, their breaths rising in pale clouds. They carried books close to their chests, their heads bowed beneath the weight of prayers unending. At the corner of the cloister, a candle was set upon a small wooden stand. The spark touched its wick, and the flame awoke, bending briefly in. The night wind before straightening into a thin, steady tongue of gold. Its light spilled outward, catching the edges of the arches, turning frost into glittering jewels, gilding the folds of woolen habits. As the monks passed by, their voices began, low and resonant, filling the cloister with chant. The sound rose and fell in steady rhythm, weaving with the soundless shimmer of the stars above. The candle bent to their breath, flickering in time with their syllables, its light trembling but unbroken. Wax softened, dripped, hardened upon its sides, each drop a mark of the hour slipping past. Some monks walked with rosaries slipping silently through their fingers. Others carried small books, reading by the faint glow as they circled the cloister, lips moving in whispered prayers. The flame glimmered on the beads, on the ink, on the thin lines of their faces. Shadows stretched across the stones, long and wavering, moving with each turn of the procession. The chant deepened. Arches, it became more than voice, more than sound. It became a presence, a river of words flowing unbroken through the night. The candle's flame bent low when the wind sighed through the garden, then lifted again, strong against the cold. Hours passed, the monks circled, prayed, bowed, rose again. Their figures moved like shadows within shadows, steady and patient. The candle burned lower, its wax hollowing, its flame smaller. Yet its glow still touched each face, each page, each bead. At last the abbot lifted his hand. The chant ceased, the footsteps stilled, the cloister sank into silence. The monks folded, their hands bowed once more, and departed into the dark corridors. The cloister stood empty, the stars still watching, the frost gleaming faintly. The candle burned alone, its flame faint, its wick curled, its wax nearly gone. It shone a moment longer, casting its light upon the frozen fountain, upon the arches, upon the silence itself. Then a hand reached, and with a breath the flame was gone. Smoke drifted upward, pale against the stars, curling into the night air before vanishing into the sky. the candle waited once more, carrying within it the memory of voices joined in darkness, of prayers lifted beneath the cold watch of heaven. The cottage was small, its roof low and thatched, its walls of timber pressed close against the cold. Smoke curled weakly from the hearth, carrying the faint smell of peat, though the fire within had nearly died. A child lay upon the straw bed, his breath shallow, his face pale as milk. His mother sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes red from weeping. The door opened and a monk entered, his cloak heavy with frost. In his hand he carried the candle, its body shortened, its sides scarred with pale rivers of wax. He set it upon a rough wooden stool near the bed, and the spark was given. The flame rose at once, bending in the draught that slipped through the cracks in the walls, then steadying into a narrow beam of gold. The glow filled the small room, pushing back the shadows that clung to the corners. It fell upon the child's face, upon the mother's trembling hands, upon the rough beams overhead blackened with smoke. It touched the iron pot that hung above the embers, the earthen bowls stacked upon a shelf, a rosary that dangled from the monk's wrist. The monk knelt, his lips moving in prayer. The mother bent her head beside him, her tears falling softly into her lap. The candle burned steadily, its flame casting long shadows that danced across the walls, turning the straw bed into a place of vigil. Turning silence into prayer, the wax softened, slipped, hardened again. Drops gathered at the rim, fell upon the stool, cooling into pale beads. The flame wavered as the child stirred, his breath rattling faintly, then steadied as the boy grew still again. Each flicker marked the passing of a moment too fragile to hold outside. The wind pressed against the door, carrying with it the howl of wolves far across the fields. Snow drifted against the walls, seeping cold into the timbers. But within, the candle's light held. It touched the boy's closed eyelids, his lips faintly parted, his small hands curled upon the blanket. It gilded the tears upon the mother's cheeks, the lines of sorrow upon her face, the quiet strength in her bowed shoulders. The hours passed, measured by wax, measured by prayer. At times the child moaned, at times he lay silent, his breath a thread that might break at any moment. The monk's voice never ceased, soft and low, weaving psalm after psalm into the air. The candle listened, its flame bending, lifting, answering in silence. When dawn approached, pale light seeped through the cracks of the shutter. The fire in the hearth had gone out, leaving only ash. The child stirred once more, his breath catching, then settling into quiet stillness. The mother clutched his hand, her tears falling freely now, her lips moving without sound. The monk bowed his head lower, his voice softening into the final prayer. The candle burned low, its flame faint, its wax hollow. At last a hand reached, and with a breath the light was gone. Smoke curled upward, mingling with the breath of dawn. Lingering for a moment in the stillness before fading into the air, the candle waited once more, scarred and shortened, carrying within it the memory of a night when sorrow sat close. And a single flame was all that held the darkness away. The great hall was alive with the murmur of voices, a rare sound within walls so often filled only with chant. Travelers had come from distant roads, pilgrims and merchants, their cloaks heavy with dust, their faces lined by wind and weather. The monks had opened their doors to them, as they always did, and in honor of their arrival, the tables were spread with what little could be spared. The candle was carried in among the others. Its body shortened, its sides ridged and uneven, yet still it stood straight within its holder of brass. A spark touched its wick, and the flame lifted eagerly, casting a circle of gold across the wooden boards of the long tables. One by one, other candles joined it, until the hall glowed with a soft radiance that softened the stern lines of stone and timber. The glow fell upon loaves of bread stacked in rough baskets, upon bowls of beans and dried fish, upon pitchers of ale that caught the light and gleamed amber. It touched the faces of monks and travelers alike. Eyes brightened, cheeks warmed, smiles breaking quietly through the solemnity. The walls, usually so cold and bare, now shone with the flicker of laughter, the voices rose. At first low, careful, uncertain, then louder, freer. Travelers shared stories of distant lands, of storms upon the sea, of wolves in the forests, of markets bright with color. The monks listened, their lips curving faintly, their eyes glimmering in the firelight. Children of the villagers, permitted this night to enter, stared wide-eyed, their small hands clutching crusts of bread, their faces aglow with wonder. The candle burned steadily, its flame bending gently when the hall filled with the breath of laughter, lifting again as the voices swelled. Wax softened, slipped down, hardened into pale ridges that glistened like carvings. Each drop marked a moment of warmth, each flicker echoed the rhythm of joy. A minstrel lifted a small harp, its strings catching the glow, and began to play. Notes rose and fell, weaving with the voices, filling the hall with music that shimmered in the air like silver thread. Some hummed along, others clapped softly. The children swayed where they sat. The candle's flame trembled with each sound. As though dancing, as though singing, the night wore on. The bread was broken, the bowls emptied, the ale drunk, yet still the light remained, casting its circle upon weary travelers who found comfort, upon monks who found respite, upon villagers who found laughter. For a few hours, hunger was forgotten, loneliness set aside, and the world seemed less harsh beneath the glow of the flames. At last, the music faded, the voices softened, the guests lay down upon benches and straw, their cloaks wrapped around. Them, the monks moved quietly, their hands gentle, their steps light, extinguishing the flames one by one. Smoke curled upward, pale and fragrant, mingling with the scent of bread and ale, drifting into the beams above. The familiar candle burned. Last, its flame bent low, its wick curled, its wax hollow. For a moment it glowed upon faces at rest, upon hands folded in sleep, upon smiles still faintly lingering. Then a hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath the light was gone. Smoke lingered, curling upward into the stillness of the hall. The candle waited once more, bearing within it the memory of a night when voices rose in joy, when strangers found welcome. Shadows were driven back, not by solemn prayer, but by laughter shared. The tower rose above the monastery like a finger of stone pointing into the dark. Its narrow stairs wound upward, cold beneath the feet, echoing each step with a hollow weight. The wind pressed hard against the outer walls, slipping through the arrow slits with a low moan, carrying with it the scent of pine from the forest, and the far-off howl of wolves. A monk climbed slowly, his cloak wrapped close, his breath misting in the chill. In his hand he bore the candle, its body now much shortened, its sides scarred with hardened streams of wax. When he reached the small chamber at the tower's crown, he set it into a simple iron stand by the slit of a window. A spark touched the wick, and once more the flame awoke, out, trembling in the draught before steadying. A thin tongue of gold against the endless dark. The light spilled outward, not far, but far enough. It gleamed upon the stone floor, upon the wooden stool, upon the worn hands of the brother who sat to keep watch. Beyond the window, it cast no more than a faint glow onto the snow-drifted roofs of the monastery below. Yet even that little flame seemed defiant, small heart beating against the vastness of night. The monk sat still, his eyes fixed upon the shadows of the forest that stretched beyond the valley. His lips moved faintly in prayer, his fingers running along a string of wooden beads. From time to time he lifted his gaze to the stars, distant and cold, shining like watchfires upon the heavens. The candle's flame bent low when the wind gusted, then rose again, stubborn, steady. Wax slid in thin streams, hardening in jagged layers at the base. The flame bent to each breath of the monk, touched the curve of his hood, glimmered on his eyes as they strained against the dark. Outside, the forest swayed, the night was alive with movement unseen. But here in the tower there was only the flame, the man, and silence. Hours passed, bells rang faintly below, marking the night's divisions. The monk stirred, stretching his stiff limbs, then bowed his head again in patience. The candle burned lower, its body hollowing, its flames smaller. Yet still it endured, bearing witness not only to the fields and walls, but to the watchful solitude of a man alone with his duty. Toward dawn, the stars faded, their fires drowned. In the slow gray light of morning, the forest grew pale, the roofs of the monastery glistened with frost. The monk rose, gathering his cloak about him, and bowed his head before the flame. Then his hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and with a breath the light was gone. Smoke curled upward in the narrow chamber, drifting out through the slit into the awakening sky. The candle waited once more, its body nearly spent, carrying the memory of a night when its light had kept company with a solitary watch, small against the endless dark. The spring returned. But it came pale and hesitant, as though winter had not fully loosed its grip. The fields beyond the monastery walls were damp with thaw, the soil heavy and dark, the trees still bare save for the first shy buds. The bells called the people once more, their sounds slow, resonant, carrying across the valley like a summons. Both hopeful and weary. Asterisk, within the church, the air was chill, yet softer than in months before. The monks had laid fresh rushes upon the stone floor. Sprigs of early herb sage and rosemary were scattered along the altar steps, their fragrance faint but sweet. Candles stood ready, pale and new, though among them was placed the old. A familiar one, shortened now almost to its end, its body thick with scars, its wick blackened from countless nights. The spark touched it, and the flame rose again. Smaller than before, weaker perhaps, yet steady. Its light fell across the linen cloth of the altar, upon the chalice, upon the pages of the book whose words had been read so many times that the air itself seemed to remember them. Round it the other flames joined, filling the nave with a golden hush that mingled with the first pale light slipping through the high windows. The people entered, their steps careful, their faces worn from the long hunger of winter. They carried baskets not of plenty, but of what little they could, spare handfuls of grain, a few eggs, a small jar of honey. These were placed before the altar, offered with bowed heads and whispered prayers. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed, watching the flames as though they might promise warmth for the months to come. The monks began their chant. It rose low and steady, weaving through the arches, mingling with the smoke of incense that drifted upward in slow silver threads. The candle bent to the rhythm of their voices, flickering faintly, then steadying, casting its circle of light upon bowed heads, upon clasped hands, upon eyes closed in silence. The wax softened quickly, sliding down in narrow streams, hardening. Upon its sides and ridges pale as bone. Its body was nearly gone, its flame small, but unwavering. Shadows bent across the pillars, across the faces of saints painted in glass, across the woven tapestry that trembled faintly in the draught. The priest raised the chalice. The candle's glow touched the rim of silver, turning it bright, scattering sparks across the altar. The people bowed their heads, their lips moving in unison, their breath rising like a sigh of earth itself. For a moment the church seemed filled not with stone, but with light of candles, light of dawn, light of voices bound together in fragile hope. The chant faded, and the offerings were gathered. The people crossed themselves, rose, and filed out slowly into the pale morning, their steps soft upon the rushes, their eyes lifted as though searching for spring hidden within the cold. The monks lingered a while longer, finishing their prayers, their voices now faint, their figures small. Beneath the arches, the familiar candle burned lower still, its flame faint, its wax hollowed, its sides scarred by years. When at last the hall was empty, a hand reached, 2 fingers pinched, and the light was ended. Smoke rose upward, curling toward the beams, mingling with the last threads of incense. Lingering in the silence, the candle waited once more, almost at its end, carrying the memory of a spring right where even the smallest flame was a prayer for renewal. The sacristy was quiet that evening, more quiet than usual. The walls seemed to lean inward, the air heavy with the weight of memory. Upon a narrow shelf lay many candles, tall and pale, their sides smooth, their bodies whole. Beside them rested the familiar one, shortened now to a mere remnant, its sides Thick with scars, its wick blackened, its form bowed with the burden of years. It had been set aside more than once, nearly forgotten, yet now a hand reached for it with care. As though recognizing it must burn one last time, the monk carried it to the altar, placing it within a simple iron holder. Around it, new candles stood waiting, fresh and unmarked, ready to serve the seasons to come. But only this one was chosen to burn tonight, its final vigil. The church was dim, the vast arches sunk in shadow, the windows dark against the gathering night. When the spark touched its wick, the flame lifted slowly, uncertain, then steadied. It was small, weaker than before, yet still it glowed. Still it reached into the darkness. Still it defied the silence. The light fell upon the altar cloth, upon the chalice, upon the worn pages of the psalter, opened nearby. It spread across the stones, gilding the edges of the cross above. Glimmering faintly upon the faces of saints painted long ago in glass, now darkened by night, the flame bent in the faintest draught, but straightened again, stubborn and patient. Only a few monks had gathered. Their voices were soft, their chant slower than ever, as though they too carried the weight of ending. The sound echoed faintly, more fragile than in years past, rising like a thin thread into the high arches. The candle listened, its flame flickering. Gently with each note, as if bowing to the rhythm of prayer, wax slid quickly now, the body too thin to hold much longer. Drops hardened into uneven shapes, ridges sharp and pale as bone. The flame wavered, then steadied, then wavered again, its light weaker, its strength fading. Yet still it touched the chalice, still it kissed the cross, still it held the shadows at bay. The monks' chant fell silent. One by one they lowered their heads, their lips moving in private prayer. The air was heavy with the mingled scent of wax and incense, a perfume of centuries. The candle burned lower, its wick curled, its wax nearly gone. At last the abbot rose. He approached the altar, his steps slow, his eyes lowered. He placed his hands upon the book, upon the chalice, then lifted his gaze to the small, trembling flame. For a long moment he stood there, as though watching not just a candle, but the passing of time itself, the memory of all nights and days that flame had seen. Then he reached forward. His fingers cupped the air, and with a single breath, the light was gone. Smoke rose upward, thin and gray, curling gently, drifting toward the high vaults until it was lost among the stones. While darkness folded back across the altar, filling every corner, every arch, every beam, the candle was finished. Its body spent, its wax hardened into twisted remains. Yet in its silence lingered the memory of every vigil it had kept, every prayer it had witnessed, every tear, every chant, every breath of life it had illuminated. It would never burn again. But its light had not been lost. It remained in the pages of books written beneath its glow, in the faces once warmed by its fire, in the voices that had risen beside it. And so, though the wax was gone, the candle's life endured in memory, in silence, in the enduring breath of flame that no darkness could wholly claim.